In the last lecture module, we discussed the cosmological argument and its origins in the thinking of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle about the origins of motion. Now we want to look at how philosophers and theologians responded to the cosmological argument, their assessment of its efficacy, its goodness, its validity. And Russell sort of combines the two major concerns that we see emerging regarding the cosmological or first cause argument for the existence of a worshipful monotheistic deity. So what Russell tells us is that the mere appearance of a contradiction that we get there on line 5 from our thoughts beginning on line 2 with that principle of sufficient reason, this idea that if we suppose that effects must have causes, those causes must exist prior to the effect, they must be sufficient to bring it about. This seems to be the way our explanations of effects work with causality. But if that's how our explanations work, it seems like ultimately we can't explain anything because every explanation would go on and on and on forever. And moving forward through time, we would have to go through an infinite causal sequence before we got to the current moment. And of course, the point of being infinite is it's never ending. And so you couldn't start at a beginning, there is no beginning, and get to an end, there is no end. So that contradiction, in and of itself, Russell wants to claim, is insufficient to establish the truth of the conclusion of the cosmological argument, namely that a worshipful monotheistic deity actually exists. That conclusion we get on line 7 of the argument. And in particular, what Russell wants to point to is that the conclusion that an uncaused cause exists, that conclusion we get on line 6 there, that doesn't establish the existence of a worshipful monotheistic deity that is in fact identical to that uncaused cause. And he really gives us two reasons, and these two reasons are the two major concerns that philosophers and theologians have about the cosmological argument. So he considers one possibility first. He says, look, if everything has to have a cause, so suppose we stick to our guns on C2 and the principle of sufficient reason, right? If we think that that's an exceptionless universal principle, that every effect must have a cause, that cause must exist prior to the effect, and it must be sufficient to bring it about. If we think that's true for all of our instances of causality in the real world, then it's true for everything. And so he says, if everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. So either this principle is exceptionless and universal, or it's not. If it is, then it can't be used to establish the existence of an uncaused cause or a worshipful monotheistic deity. What if we don't think it's exceptionless? What if we think there have to be exceptions? We see now that it's not an exceptionless universal principle. There have to be cases that violate it. And in thinking about that, he says, if there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God. So there can't be any validity in the argument. And the idea behind this second criticism is, look, if we say, yes, we've got to limit or abandon that principle of sufficient reason, we have to suppose that there are causes that themselves don't have causes, uncaused causes. If we suppose that's true, then getting from that to the existence of a monotheistic deity, that is a huge chasm ideologically. So why just one uncaused cause? Why not many? Well, we just want one, but there's nothing about abandoning that principle that says it only can be abandoned for one thing. Likewise, being an uncaused cause isn't the same thing as being a worshipful monotheistic deity. And so even if you suppose there's just one violation, there is just one uncaused cause, there isn't any reason to suppose that uncaused cause is in fact this monotheistic deity and not something else like the universe. And we can see why it is that there's this ideological chasm there when we realize that, oh yeah, Aristotle used this argument talking about motion. The argument itself is really just about causality. And so Aristotle wanted to conclude not that there was a monotheistic worshipful deity, but instead he wanted to conclude that there was an unmoved thing that moves. Likewise, we can just use the argument to conclude, well, there's an uncaused thing that causes. We don't have to imbue it with omnipotence or omniscience or omnibenevolence and all of the things that we associate with a monotheistic deity. There's nothing about being an uncaused cause that implies any of that stuff. And so these are the two concerns that philosophers and theologians have had about whether or not the cosmological argument can establish the existence of a monotheistic deity. Now, remember, I talked about Immanuel Kant's criticism of the ontological argument. And in fact, part of what he wrote was about the relationship between the cosmological and the ontological argument. And so what Kant said was, look, the problem with the cosmological argument is neither alternative seems rationally or reasonably acceptable. So the principle of sufficient reason is true, hence we've got infinite explanations, infinite causal chains going back. That doesn't seem right. But also, there's an uncaused cause. That doesn't seem right because the principle of sufficient reason, that is how we explain stuff. Neither one seems satisfactory. And so Kant said in order to accept that second idea that there's an uncaused cause, we need to have a reason to suppose that there really is an uncaused cause. Not just that it would be nice if there was, that solves our problem, because it doesn't really solve our problem. It's unsatisfactory. We need an independent reason. And so he said the independent reason, the only one out there on offer, is the ontological argument. So he says the cosmological argument can't establish the existence of an uncaused cause on its own. You need an independent reason. The only independent reason is the ontological argument. And then he said, I don't think the ontological argument establishes the existence of a necessarily existing being, an uncaused cause. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to the next argument, the teleological argument, or the argument from design.